At 75, I can no longer stay silent about the marriage the world once called a fairy tale with Björn Ulvaeus. For decades, people believed we lived inside music, lights, and everlasting love, but are you certain you ever knew what truly happened behind those songs? Today, I will reveal the tragedies never told, and the only question is, do you have the courage to listen until the very end? I was only 19 when a single afternoon backstage quietly rewrote the rest of my life, and the truth behind that moment was never as innocent as it seemed. It was a small television studio in Sweden, nothing glamorous, nothing that hinted at destiny. The kind of place where cables ran across the floor like careless thoughts, where the lights hummed softly, and where no one imagined history might be waiting behind a thin curtain. I remember standing there, smoothing my dress with nervous fingers, telling myself it was just another rehearsal, just another song, just another day. I was young then. Not famous. Not protected. I still believed that talent alone could keep a heart safe. The air smelled faintly of dust and warm electronics. Somewhere nearby, a technician laughed. Someone called my name. I stepped forward, unaware that a door inside me was about to open and never fully close again. He walked in carrying a guitar. Not dramatically. Not like a man announcing himself. He simply appeared, leaning slightly forward, the strap resting against his shoulder, his fingers absent-mindedly brushing the strings as if music lived in his hands even when he was silent. He looked up, and for a brief second our eyes met. I looked away first. It wasn't attraction the way people later described it. It was recognition. The unsettling feeling that something had already begun before either of us had agreed to it. We were introduced quickly. Names exchanged. Polite smiles. Nothing more. Yet I noticed how his eyes lingered, how they studied rather than admired. I noticed how the room seemed to adjust itself around him, how conversation softened when he spoke. I told myself I was imagining things. Someone suggested we try a song together. There was no ceremony to it. No build-up. Just a quiet suggestion, like the turning of a page. He adjusted the guitar. I stepped toward the microphone. The glass of the studio booth reflected a version of me I barely recognized, a girl standing on the edge of something unnamed. He played the first chord. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. But it felt alive. I opened my mouth and sang, and something strange happened. The room went still. Not silent, but attentive, as if even the walls were listening. I forgot where I was. I forgot the cameras. I forgot the people watching through the glass. I only knew the sound between us. His playing shifted to follow my voice. My voice bent instinctively toward his harmony. We weren't performing for the studio. We were discovering each other in real time, note by note, breath by breath. I had sung before, many times, but never like that. Never with the sensation that my voice was being held rather than heard. When the song ended, no one spoke. I remember the way my heart raced, not with excitement, but with something closer to fear. I had the sudden, irrational thought that I had given something away without meaning to. Something I would not be able to take back. He looked at me then and smiled, not wide, not triumphant, but soft. As if we were sharing a secret that hadn't yet learned how to be dangerous. We spoke afterward, quietly, almost shyly. He told me my voice sounded honest. I told him his guitar made me forget where I was in the song. We laughed. It felt harmless. It felt young. It felt like standing in sunlight without knowing how easily it burns. In the weeks that followed, we sang together again. Small rooms. Small audiences. Places where applause sounded close and personal, where people leaned forward rather than back. He always arrived early. I always noticed when he entered. He walked beside me, not ahead, not behind. Sometimes his hand brushed mine, briefly, as if by accident. I told myself it was music. Just music. But music has a way of teaching you what your heart wants before your mind is ready to understand it. He listened when I spoke. I listened when he played. We learned each other's rhythms without effort. I felt seen in a way I had never felt before, not as a girl, not as a singer, but as something unfinished and full of possibility. Looking back now, I can see how fragile it all was. How thin the line between wonder and loss can be. But at 19, fragility looks like beauty. It looks like promise. It feels like the beginning of a song you believe will never end. We didn't talk about the future. We didn't talk about consequences. There were no warnings, no shadows, no sense of danger. Only melodies, laughter, and the quiet certainty that something special was happening. I didn't know then that first moments are often the kindest liars. That afternoon in that small studio became a memory I would carry for the rest of my life. A memory untouched by pain, frozen in its innocence. When I think of it now, it still feels warm, still feels gentle, still feels unbearably delicate. That was the beginning. If you remember your own first moment of believing in love, you already know why this part of the story hurts the most, and if you stay with me, you will see how something so beautiful slowly learned how to break. If this story speaks to you, staying with the channel is the quiet way to support voices that were silent for too long. I once believed the tight grip of his hand was love, but years later I realized it was the first boundary I never agreed to cross. We began singing everywhere together. Small stages first, then larger rooms where the lights were brighter and the applause lingered longer. He always reached for my hand before we walked on. His fingers wrapped around mine firmly, almost urgently, as if letting go for even a moment might change something essential. At the time, I felt chosen. Protected. Wanted. When we finished a performance, he would guide me quickly toward the back, steering me away from the waiting crowd. Especially the women. He smiled politely, nodded, but never slowed down. His hand tightened just a little more when we passed them. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have someone who cared so much, someone who did not like to share. I mistook possession for devotion. We traveled like that for months. Singing. Rehearsing. Driving through quiet roads where the windows stayed fogged and the radio hummed softly between us. He planned everything. Where we would go. When we would leave. Who we would see. I followed without question, telling myself that love meant trust, and trust meant not asking too many things out loud. When he proposed, it felt natural, almost inevitable. Like the next verse of a song already written. The wedding took place during a Nordic summer, beside a lake so still it looked unreal. The sky stretched wide and pale above us. The air smelled of water and pine. I wore white. He played his guitar for me, his voice low and steady, singing as if no one else existed. For a moment, I believed we were inside a painting. Everyone said it was perfect. The photographs looked perfect. Two young people. Music in their eyes. A future that seemed sealed by melody and promise. I smiled because smiling was easy then. I did not know yet how much effort it would take later. Even that day, though, there were things I noticed only in fragments. The way his attention shifted when others approached. The way women watched him, their gazes lingering longer than they meant to. I told myself it was normal. He was talented. He shone. People are drawn to light. As long as he looked at me, I thought, nothing else mattered. After we married, the world around us grew louder. The stages grew higher. The crowds grew closer. Wherever we went, eyes followed him. I stood beside him, smiling, singing, holding his hand, feeling both visible and strangely unseen at the same time. He began to stand slightly in front of me. Just a step. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for me to feel it. When women approached after shows, he stayed close, his arm firm around my waist. He spoke for both of us. Answered questions before I could. Laughed easily. I laughed too, even when my voice felt delayed, like it was arriving a second too late. I told myself this was partnership. Looking back, I see how carefully everything was arranged. How my world slowly narrowed without me realizing it. Music was always the reason. The schedule. The pressure. The dream. Whenever I felt a small discomfort, I swallowed it, afraid of being the one who disrupted harmony. I remember thinking, if I just stay quiet, everything will stay beautiful. But silence has weight. It presses down slowly, so slowly you do not notice until breathing becomes harder. I loved him. That much is true. I loved the way he played. I loved the way our voices blended. I loved the idea of us, standing together while the world watched. But somewhere along the way, love stopped feeling like a place I could rest. It became something I had to earn by being agreeable, by being patient, by being small. At the time, I still called it love. Only later did I understand how love should never make you feel watched while holding your hand. The wedding photographs still exist. People still share them. They still call them beautiful. And they are. Beauty is not a lie. It is just incomplete. No one sees what happens outside the frame. No one hears what is not said. No one feels the quiet tension hidden behind a perfect smile. I did not know then that the same light drawing the world toward him was also beginning to cast a longer shadow behind us. If any part of this sounds familiar, you will understand why the story does not grow easier from here, and in the next part, you will see how success began to widen the distance between us even more. The night the world began calling us a miracle was the same night I felt something inside me quietly begin to fracture, and the truth behind that applause was never told. Benny entered our lives almost casually, as if he had always been meant to be there. I remember the first time I watched the two of them talk. They leaned toward each other, voices low, hands moving as they spoke about chords and melodies only they fully understood. I stood nearby, listening, smiling, feeling both included and strangely invisible at the same time. From that moment on, everything accelerated. Songs were written quickly. Ideas spilled out faster than anyone could catch them. Rehearsals filled our days and nights. Small rooms echoed with laughter, arguments about harmonies, sudden bursts of excitement when something finally sounded right. We talked about changing music, about doing something new, something the world had not heard before. It felt like standing at the edge of a wave. When the group finally took shape, when the name ABBA settled into place, it felt simple and monumental all at once. 4 people. 2 couples. 1 shared dream. We practiced until our voices blended without effort, until our movements on stage felt natural, almost instinctive. There was a sense of purpose that wrapped around us, a feeling that we were building something larger than ourselves. I believed that building something together would bring us closer. Waterloo arrived like a spark. The song was playful, confident, impossible to ignore. When we performed it at Eurovision, the lights were blinding, the crowd a sea of movement and sound. I remember the exact moment the applause exploded, rolling toward us like thunder. People were standing. Screaming. Celebrating. We had won. Everyone around me was smiling. Hugging. Crying with joy. I smiled too, because that is what you do when the world tells you you have reached the top. But inside, my chest felt tight. Not from excitement. From fear. Success is loud. Fear is quiet. Overnight, everything changed. Interviews filled our schedules. Cameras followed us everywhere. Our faces appeared on screens, on posters, in magazines I never imagined holding in my hands. People called us icons. They called us perfect. They called us the sound of happiness. They did not see the silence that followed us back to hotel rooms. Applause does not ask how you are doing. It only asks you to return the favor. We traveled constantly. Cities blurred together. Stages grew larger. The lights grew hotter. Each performance demanded more energy, more precision, more smiles. I learned how to stand in the right place, how to turn at the right moment, how to look effortless while my heart beat far too fast. Björn and Benny disappeared into music together. They wrote endlessly, chasing ideas, refining melodies, living inside the future of the next song. I watched them from across the room, my husband leaning toward another man in complete creative focus, and I felt proud of him. And lonely. Winning did not feel like safety. It felt like exposure. People cheered our songs about love, dancing, joy. They believed every word. They sang along as if those melodies were promises. But behind the stage, behind the smiles, I felt myself shrinking into a supporting role in a story that no longer paused to ask how I felt. The brighter the lights became, the harder it was to feel warmth. I remember walking on stage one night, the crowd roaring so loudly it vibrated through my bones. I held the microphone, looked out at thousands of faces, and felt completely alone. That loneliness shocked me more than anything else. I had everything people dream of. Fame. Success. Admiration. And yet, something essential was slipping away. Björn stood beside me, smiling, confident, fully alive in the moment. The world adored him. I adored him too, or at least the version of him that still looked back at me. But more and more, his eyes were fixed on the horizon, on what came next, on the music that had begun to demand everything from him. Clapping hands filled the air. Cameras flashed. Fans screamed our names. None of it felt gentle. None of it felt like home. At night, when the noise finally faded, I lay awake listening to silence press in. Silence thick with unasked questions. Silence heavy with the sense that something precious was being traded for something shiny and unstoppable. I did not know how to say it then. I only knew how to sing. People told us we were lucky. They told us success like this happens once in a lifetime. They told us to enjoy it. I nodded, smiled, did my part. But deep down, I began to understand a truth no one ever applauds. Winning does not mean you are safe. Applause does not mean you are loved. And light does not mean you are warm. The world saw four people standing together, radiant, unstoppable. I felt two paths slowly drifting apart beneath the same spotlight. The music carried us forward whether we were ready or not, and stopping was never an option. Every cheer pushed us higher. Every success pulled us further from the quiet place where love once lived. Sometimes I wonder if anyone watching could sense it. That subtle shift. That moment when joy stopped feeling like joy and started feeling like obligation. If you have ever reached something you thought you wanted, only to realize it cost more than you expected, you might already understand what I could not yet put into words. Standing there, bathed in light, crowned by success, I asked myself a question I was too afraid to answer. Had I just reached the top, or was I already beginning to fall? If this part of the story resonates with you, you are not alone, and in the next chapter you will see how music itself slowly became the distance between us. I learned too late that music does not share space with love, and the secret I am about to reveal began quietly, between tours, nights, and silence. We were suddenly everywhere. Airports before sunrise. Hotels that all smelled the same. Dressing rooms filled with noise, laughter, rushing voices, and the constant pressure to be ready, to be perfect, to be grateful. The world opened its doors to us, and we stepped through them without stopping to ask what we were leaving behind. On stage, everything looked unified. 4 voices. 1 sound. Smiles timed to the beat. The crowd sang with us as if they knew our lives. But when the lights went down, when the applause dissolved into echoes, something invisible settled between us. Distance does not always arrive through arguments. Sometimes it arrives through schedules. Björn and Benny wrote constantly. In hotel rooms. In studios that smelled of smoke and stale coffee. In quiet corners where ideas mattered more than sleep. Music followed us everywhere, like a fifth presence that never rested. I watched Björn sit at a piano long after midnight, his back to me, his head bent forward, his hands moving as if they belonged to someone else. I told myself it was beautiful to love someone so devoted to his art. We toured city after city. London. Paris. Tokyo. New York. The names blurred. The days repeated. Every night, the roar of the crowd felt larger than the night before. I sang my heart out, smiled, bowed, returned backstage, and waited for something I could not name. Often, he did not notice. After shows, while others celebrated, he drifted back to the studio. If there was no studio, he created one. A desk. A guitar. A piano in a corner of the room. Music filled every gap. Every silence. Every space where conversation might have lived. I began to understand that silence can be loud. I asked him once what he was thinking about. He did not look up. He simply said, "The next song." Always the next song. His voice carried no cruelty. No dismissal. Just truth. That sentence stayed with me longer than any lyric. I did not accuse. I did not argue. I did not demand attention. I stood beside him and tried to be patient, believing that love meant endurance. I believed that if I stayed quiet enough, understanding enough, supportive enough, the balance would return. But music does not pause for understanding. Night after night followed the same pattern. The crowd outside. The quiet inside. The sound of a pencil scratching against paper. The soft tapping of keys. Sometimes rain against the window. Sometimes nothing at all. I lay awake listening, not to music, but to the absence of words. When he finally came to bed, he carried the studio with him. His mind stayed elsewhere. His body rested, but his thoughts kept moving forward, always ahead of us, always reaching for something just out of sight. I did not feel betrayed. That is the strange part. I felt replaced. Music became the center of his world, and I circled around it, trying not to disturb its gravity. On stage, I was essential. In the songs, my voice mattered. But in the quiet moments that make a marriage feel real, I slowly faded into the background. We smiled for cameras. We answered interviews with practiced lines. We talked about success, about joy, about teamwork. I spoke about how lucky I was. And in many ways, I was. But luck does not protect you from loneliness. Sometimes, I caught my reflection in mirrors backstage. Perfect hair. Perfect makeup. A face the world recognized. I looked at that woman and wondered when she had stopped being seen by the person standing closest to her. Music filled every space where tenderness might have grown. I remember standing in a studio late one night, the lights dim, the air thick with exhaustion. Björn and Benny argued gently over a chord progression. I waited at the microphone, ready to sing when they were done. Minutes passed. Then more. No one noticed I was there. I did not interrupt. I did not clear my throat. I simply waited. That was when the realization began to take shape, slowly, painfully. I was part of the sound, not the silence. I belonged to the song, not the space between songs. Love requires presence. Music demanded disappearance. We traveled more. The world cheered louder. The songs grew bigger. And the distance grew quieter. There were no dramatic moments. No breaking points anyone could point to. Just a gradual shift, like a melody changing key without warning. I stopped asking questions that did not receive answers. Instead, I listened. I listened to the hum of studio equipment at night. To footsteps in hotel hallways. To the low murmur of voices through closed doors. I listened to my own voice on records and wondered if the woman singing still believed the words. He loved music the way some people love faith. Without compromise. Without doubt. And I loved him. Those two loves never found the same rhythm. By the time I understood what was happening, it already felt normal. That is how quiet losses work. They teach you to accept absence as routine. I did not feel anger. I felt small. One night, after another long rehearsal, I watched him pack up his notes, already moving toward tomorrow. I realized then that I was no longer his future. I was his present, useful, reliable, familiar. A harmony line that supported the melody but never led it. That was the moment I understood what I had become. I was only one note in an endless composition, a sound that mattered until the next one arrived. If you have ever felt yourself slowly disappear inside someone else's dream, you may already sense where this story is going, and in the next part, you will hear how a single song finally said what neither of us could. The song that finally ended my marriage was written as music, but it carried a truth neither of us ever dared to say aloud. He came to me one quiet morning with a few sheets of paper in his hand. No announcement. No explanation. Just notes and words resting lightly on the table, as if they had arrived on their own. He said I should sing it. He said no one else could. His voice was calm, almost careful, and I understood immediately that this was not a gift. It was a confession disguised as a melody. I read the lyrics slowly. Line by line. They did not accuse. They did not beg. They simply stated what had already happened. Loss. Distance. Acceptance. The kind of ending that arrives long before anyone has the courage to name it. I looked up at him, searching for something in his face. He met my eyes, gentle and distant at the same time. We did not say the word separation. We did not say goodbye. We did not say divorce. Silence filled the space where those words should have lived. The day we recorded the song, rain fell steadily outside the studio. The kind of rain that softens sound and blurs the edges of the world. Inside, the air was cold. Coffee cups sat untouched. Smoke hung faintly near the ceiling. Everything felt slowed down, as if time itself had decided to watch quietly. I stood in front of the microphone. The red light turned on. I placed the headphones over my ears and waited for the piano to begin. As the first notes played, my chest tightened. Not with fear. With recognition. This song knew me. Every line carried something I had lived but never spoken. I was in your arms thinking I belonged there. I did belong there. Once. Building me a fence, building me a home. I believed that home would last. My voice trembled, but I did not stop. I sang through it. Not carefully. Not safely. I let the words move through me exactly as they were written. Tears came quietly, without drama, without sound. They simply fell, like the rain outside, unnoticed by anyone who was not listening closely. There was no audience. No applause. Just the truth moving from my chest into the room. I did not think about how it would sound to others. I did not imagine charts or praise or success. I was not performing. I was letting go of something I had held for too long. Each line felt like a step away from a life that no longer existed. Behind the glass, he watched. His face stayed calm, but his eyes did not. I could see it even through the reflection. He was hearing the ending as clearly as I was singing it. We did not look away from each other. We did not smile. We did not nod. We simply stayed where we were, allowing the song to do what words never had. When the final note faded, no one spoke. There was no request for another take. No suggestion to adjust a phrase or soften a sound. Benny quietly said there was no need. Some things cannot be repeated. Some emotions only arrive once, and if you miss them, they are gone forever. I stepped back from the microphone, my legs weak, my hands cold. The room felt emptied of something essential. I knew then that whatever we had been holding together was finished. Not because of anger. Not because of betrayal. But because truth had finally been given a voice. After that day, we lived like shadows sharing the same space. We worked. We smiled. We stood side by side under lights that still burned brightly. But when the lights went out, we turned away from each other without needing to say why. Sometimes I caught him looking at old photographs. Our wedding day. Early performances. Faces full of belief. Once, he said softly that we had been beautiful. I did not disagree. Beauty does not protect you from endings. It only makes them harder to accept. When the song was released, the world reacted the way the world always does. They praised the emotion. They called it the greatest breakup song ever written. They said my voice carried heartbreak like no one else could. They did not know that heartbreak had written itself through me. On stage, I sang it again and again. Each time, the room grew silent in a different way. People listened. Some cried. Some held their breath. They felt something real without knowing why. I stood there, composed, steady, offering them a story they thought was fiction. It was my life. I never explained it to anyone. I never corrected the interviews. I let the song speak for me. That was enough. Music had taken what love could not save and turned it into something that would last longer than either of us. The strange thing is that I do not regret singing it. That song did not destroy me. It freed me. It allowed me to stop pretending. It allowed me to grieve without shouting. It allowed me to leave without slamming doors. There were no dramatic scenes afterward. No final arguments. Just the slow, quiet understanding that something sacred had ended and something honest had begun. Looking back now, I see how gentle the ending actually was. Painful, yes. But clear. Sometimes clarity is the kindest form of pain. That song did not belong to the world when it was written. It belonged to two people standing on opposite sides of the same truth, finally willing to let it be heard. It was not a performance. It was goodbye. If this part of the story moved you, I wonder what lesson you hear in it, and in the next chapter you will see how that quiet goodbye finally became a life lived apart. The day my marriage officially ended was so quiet it shocked me, and what happened that morning still feels heavier than anything we ever said aloud. The sky was gray when I woke up. Not dramatic gray. Just flat. Still. The kind of morning where sound feels distant, as if the world has decided not to interfere. I lay in bed longer than usual, listening to the faint tapping of rain against the window, counting nothing, thinking nothing, already knowing exactly what day it was. The house felt unfamiliar, even though I had lived there for years. Furniture stood where it always had, photographs lined the walls, but everything looked like a set after the actors had gone home. I moved slowly, afraid that any sudden motion might break something fragile inside me. On the table were the papers. Neatly stacked. White. Ordinary. They did not look like the end of a life. They looked like instructions. Lines. Spaces. Names. Dates. The language was clean and careful, designed to leave no room for feeling. I stared at them longer than necessary, not because I did not understand, but because I wanted to remember how it felt before I did. There was no argument. There had been no argument for a long time. I made coffee and did not drink it. The cup stayed warm in my hands, steam rising and disappearing before it reached my face. I thought about how many mornings we had shared in silence, believing silence was peace. I understood now that silence can also be surrender. When he arrived, there was no tension in the air. No anger. No urgency. Just the sound of a door opening and closing. Footsteps. A familiar presence that no longer felt like home. He looked at me and nodded, the way people do when they do not know what else to offer. We sat across from each other at the table. The lawyer spoke softly, reading through the documents with a voice trained to remain neutral. Words passed between us without landing anywhere. Property. Agreements. Formal endings. I watched his hands as he rested them on the table. Hands that once held mine in front of millions. Hands that now stayed still, careful not to touch. No one cried. That surprised me the most. I had imagined tears. A breaking point. Something dramatic enough to justify the pain. Instead, there was only restraint. Politeness. Two people behaving well while something irreversible happened between them. When it was time to sign, my hand shook. Not violently. Just enough to notice. I focused on the line where my name belonged, guiding the pen as if it were heavier than it should be. The ink dried quickly. Faster than I expected. He signed next. There was a moment after that where we sat in silence, unsure of what came next. There were no instructions for what you do after a life ends politely. He looked at me and said he believed this was the best thing for both of us. His voice was gentle. I did not answer. There was nothing left to clarify. In my mind, old songs played without sound. Melodies that once felt like promises now floated like distant echoes. I remembered laughter. Rehearsals. Early mornings and late nights. I remembered believing we were building something permanent. None of that appeared on the page in front of us. When he stood to leave, he hesitated. Not long. Just long enough for me to notice. He looked around the room as if committing it to memory. Then he picked up his coat. The door closed behind him with a soft click that felt louder than any applause we had ever received. I did not follow him to the window. I did not watch the car pull away. I stayed where I was, listening to the silence settle into its final shape. The house felt empty in a new way. Not abandoned. Completed. As if its purpose had quietly expired. I walked from room to room, touching familiar objects, trying to understand why everything still looked the same when nothing was. That day passed slowly. Too slowly. Time stretched and thinned, refusing to move at a normal pace. I did small things. Washed a cup. Straightened a chair. Opened a window. Closed it again. The world outside continued without hesitation. Cars passed. People talked. Life did not pause out of respect. By evening, the light faded without ceremony. I sat alone and listened to nothing. No music. No television. Just the quiet sound of my own breathing, steady and unfamiliar. There was no relief. No devastation. Only absence. I realized then that the most painful endings are not loud. They do not announce themselves. They simply remove something and leave you to notice the space it once occupied. That night, I slept without dreaming. In the days that followed, people around us behaved as if nothing had changed. We still worked. We still appeared together. We still smiled when expected. The world prefers clean stories. It prefers transitions without disruption. I learned how easy it is to disappear inside normal behavior. But inside, everything felt hollow. I had not lost a fight. I had not been abandoned in anger. I had simply reached the quiet end of something that could no longer continue. And that made the emptiness harder to explain. There was no one to blame. No final sentence to quote. Just a door that had closed and a car that had driven away, taking a shared future with it. If you have ever experienced an ending that made no noise at all, you already know why this kind of silence hurts the deepest, and in the next part, you will see what happens when a life must be rebuilt from absolute quiet. I walked away from the stage without saying goodbye, and what followed was a silence so deep it forced me to finally hear myself. I stopped performing. Not suddenly, not dramatically. I simply stepped back and did not return. The lights kept turning on without me. The music kept playing somewhere else. I chose distance because closeness had begun to hurt too much. Fame had given me everything people admire, yet none of it knew how to sit with me in the quiet. I avoided the press. Not out of anger. Out of survival. Questions carry expectations, and I no longer had answers shaped for public use. I stayed home more. I learned the rhythm of ordinary days. Mornings measured by school bags and breakfast plates. Evenings softened by small voices asking simple things. I became a mother before anything else. Raising my children grounded me in ways applause never could. They did not care about stages or songs. They cared about presence. About whether I was there. About whether I listened. I watched them grow while the world outside continued to replay my past. Old photos. Old clips. Old performances that felt like they belonged to someone else. Sometimes late at night, when the house was still, I played the old records. My voice filled the room, young and hopeful, carried by melodies I once lived inside. I sat quietly and listened, not with pride, not with pain, but with curiosity. That voice sounded fearless. It sounded certain. It sounded like someone who believed endings were impossible. I did not cry. That surprised me. I had cried enough during the years when tears still hoped to change something. Now they felt unnecessary. The sadness had settled into something calmer, heavier, more permanent. A kind of acceptance that does not need release. Silence became both medicine and wound. In the quiet, I could finally breathe without performing. I learned how much noise I had lived inside for so long. The constant demand to smile. To explain. To reassure. Without it, I felt exposed at first, like stepping outside without armor. But slowly, the quiet taught me patience. It taught me how to sit with thoughts without correcting them. Fame does not rescue you from loneliness. It only distracts others from seeing it. I was called distant. Reclusive. Difficult to understand. Those words followed me like rumors. I did not correct them. I understood that retreat looks strange to people who have never needed it. I was not hiding. I was healing, even if the process looked like disappearance. Days passed quietly. Walks by the lake. Meals shared. Homework checked. Laughter returned in small, unexpected moments. Not the loud laughter of success, but the gentle kind that comes from safety. I found comfort in repetition. In routines that did not change with headlines. At times, I missed music. Not the industry. Not the stage. Just the private act of singing without expectation. I sang softly to myself. In kitchens. In empty rooms. Without microphones. Without judgment. The sound felt different. Less urgent. More honest. I realized then that music had never abandoned me. I had simply needed to change the way I lived inside it. The hardest part was accepting how easily the world moves on. New voices arrive. New faces replace old ones. The applause shifts direction without apology. I watched it happen with surprising calm. What once terrified me now felt natural. Everything moves forward. In that movement, I learned something painful and necessary. Identity cannot be built on attention. Love cannot be sustained by success. And silence, when chosen, can be an act of strength rather than defeat. There were nights when memories returned uninvited. Stages. Lights. Harmonies. The sense of being part of something immense. I let those memories pass through me without resistance. They no longer demanded answers. They simply reminded me that I had lived fully, even when it hurt. I stopped waiting for closure from the past. Closure is something you give yourself. What remained was a quieter life. Smaller. Truer. One where I could hear my own thoughts without interruption. Where time moved slowly enough to be felt. Where I no longer had to translate my feelings into songs for others to understand. I had survived the noise. Now I was learning how to live with what came after. If any part of this quiet feels familiar to you, I wonder how you learned to sit with it, and in the final part you will see how this silence reshaped everything I thought I knew. Every piece of music needs an ending. I never truly won or lost the way the world imagined, and the final truth I am about to share changes everything you think you know about love and endings. I am older now, and time has softened what pain once sharpened. I wake up early, not because I must, but because silence feels different in the morning. The world no longer asks anything of me, and for the first time, neither do I. I walk slowly. I breathe fully. I listen more than I speak. When people ask if I regret anything, I search myself honestly. I do not regret loving deeply. I do not regret singing with my whole heart. I do not regret believing that beauty could last forever. Those beliefs did not destroy me. They shaped me. What I learned, too late and yet just in time, is that love cannot survive when it is forced to compete. Not with ambition. Not with applause. Not with the endless hunger to create something greater than the people standing beside you. Love needs stillness. It needs presence. It needs space where nothing else is trying to win. I see him sometimes now. Not as the man who broke my heart, and not as the boy who once held my hand too tightly. I see him as someone who walked the same road for a while, then turned in another direction. There is no bitterness left in that recognition. Only distance, and respect for what was. Music still lives inside me, but it no longer defines me. It is no longer a weapon, or a shield, or a confession. It is simply a memory that breathes when it wants to. And I let it. The world taught me that success is loud, but life is quiet. That endings do not always arrive with noise. And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop performing and tell yourself the truth. If this story leaves you thinking about what love asked of you and what it gave back, then perhaps the lesson is this: not every ending is a failure, and sometimes letting go is the only way to finally keep yourself.